as a biodiversity scientist, that's always been on my mind. What are we trying to protect? And we often talk about the diversity of life in terms of number of species. And so I'd like to start by addressing how many species are there? And unfortunately, this is a question that has hounded biodiversity scientists for centuries, even though we've been naming species of plants, animals, and fungi for over 3 centuries, we still do not have an answer to that question. How many species are there? Interesting, in 1994, Sir Robert May, a theoretical biologist, wrote a paper in which he calculated that, well, don't worry about how many species. We will know in the year 2044. That was the conclusion of his paper. Not how many species we have, but we will find out, don't worry. Well, we're not there yet, but we have some idea, and I'd like to review those quickly in terms of numbers of species. So let's start with plants. I'm a botanist. I know most about plants. In 2016, a group of botanists at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew, they added up all the species that they had ever recorded and came up with a figure, and this is perfect Kew in terms of preciseness, that there were 383,671 species of plants. Now, if that's not exact, I don't know what is. I did some of my own calculations based upon their numbers and determined that we probably have about 35,000 species of plants still left to discover and name and know something about. That's about 10% of what we know of plants right now. That still is more. So we're almost there. I also calculated when we might find these last 35,000 species, and my figure came out to the year 2032. A botanist will describe and discover the last species of plant on the planet, if he acts quick. But if we actually look at all of life on the planet, our estimates are still wildly speculative. And our estimates of all species range from maybe 1 million species on the planet up to 100 million species. Now, if that is imprecise, or that I don't know what is precise, it's just quite amazing. That's a pretty big spread. However, I think most biologists between that 1 to 100 million species would suggest that maybe there are 10 million species of plants, not of plants, excuse me, of all life on the planet right now. And that's, I think, a reasonable number that most people are accepting. But here's the kicker about that 10 million species. We've only identified and named 1.8 million of those 10 millions. Less than 20% of the species on the planet do we even know exist. So if we're going to protect it, we really need to speed up our process of knowing what we're protecting, and that gets to be a pretty big challenge. But even if we don't even know how many species there are on the planet, the question becomes, is it really the number of species and the breadth of species that we are really trying to protect with a half-Earth effort? And I would like to say that the answer is no. It's not numbers of species at all. That's a beginning of understanding what nature is about, but that's not the end of what we're going to try to protect. We should really define the diversity of life to what I would call the complexity of nature. And that encounters or entails some of the stuff that Bart was just talking about, and Jesse. That entails the interactions between species, not just the numbers in individual species. And so I'd like to give you an example of those interactions from some of my own research. So if we could bring up that first slide. Well, here we go. We started it. Heliconias and the hummingbirds that visit them. It's a very complex system, but couldn't be more fascinating. Okay, let's start that video now. What you're looking at here is a bronzy hermit hummingbird with a long curved bill. It's sitting on a heliconia, and you're going to see it visit a flower of heliconia. Now, not unexpectedly, that flower of heliconia has the same length and same curvature as that hummingbird's bill. They've evolved together. What's also interesting is you look at the close match between the hovering behavior of the bird, notice it's hovering, and how the flower is presented by the plant so the bird can get to it. There's also an exact look, you can see the pollen being placed on the head of that hummingbird. There's an exact placement of the pollen to make sure that that flower is fertilized so the plant can reproduce. And the last thing, which you really can't see from this video, is that the flower produces the exact amount of nectar in both concentration and amount that the hummingbird needs for its own energy needs. So this is a system of interactions between a bird and a plant that have evolved probably over 5 million years that is really the complexity of nature that we're talking about. I think we have time for just one more. If you could bring up that next one, and this is just going to take a few seconds because I want you to see one of the most interesting behaviors of a hummingbird I've seen. This hummingbird, this is called a green hermit hummingbird, has evolved the ability to fly upside down in order to correctly visit this flower of heliconia. This goes on for hours, but he can get his bill in there with the same curvature, the same length into this flower by flying upside down, and he or she has learned to do it. Okay, we can stop there. So this is just one interaction between this system of birds and the plants that they pollinate. But if you look closely at that bird and that tree or that plant, there's all these other interactions going on. If you really knew what you're looking for, you could have seen a mite run out of the nostril of the hummingbird into the flower to suck up nectar while the hummingbird is pollinating there. It would run back in and then goes to the next flower. There's also beetles that live on the plants that only feed on these plants, and they have specialized microbiomes in their guts that allow them to process the biochemicals in the plant. It just goes on, and there's mites that live on the beetles that are feeding on this sort of interaction is just fantastic. And that's really the complexity of life that I think we have to be thinking about and what we want to protect when we want to protect 50% of the planet. This complexity of life is really what we're losing when intact environments become degraded landscapes. Of course, we are losing species, but we're also losing all these multitude of interactions as one species goes extinct. So Half Earth, in my mind, is about conserving this complexity of nature, as well as conserving all the species that are involved in these interactions.